I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss an abundance of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and genre deep dives, and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. As I just alluded to, today on this podcast, Tom and I will dive into the genre of grunge music in our first ever genre deep dive.
We're going for it.
Where did grunge music come from? What are the seminal grunge albums? And what is grunge's impact on the wonderful world of music? However, before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device, and you can automatically get our latest podcast episode sent to your device each week. Also, Velocities in Music does not want your money. We also don't want to introduce ads into the podcast yet. Right now, all we want is for you to share Velocities in Music with family or friends whom you think would benefit from joining in on the music discussion Tom and I attempt to create every week. Tom.
Yeah.
Let's start this off.
All right.
By describing grunge music. What is grunge music? What makes grunge music grunge music?
It sounds grungy.
It's all about the attitude, man.
You just put a Y at the end of the word and then it becomes an adjective. No, in all reality, grunge as a form of music, it's really hard to draw a line on what's grunge and what's not, because you can consider some things to be grungy and have some elements of grunge without someone really being a grunge band. And this is hard to define when you're going from like the late 80s into early 90s when grunge music kind of hit the mainstream. But in essence, the way I think of it is it's a blend of influences from heavy metal to punk rock.
Right.
Taking those, blending them together. Anything from kind of sludge metal to fast-paced, just kind of thrashy alternative rock with that punk influence. Anything like that, to me, embodies grunge as an attitude, as a form of music, as a style. That's what it's all about to me.
With a dash of rebellion in there.
Yeah.
Because grunge did not want to be either of those two genres. In fact, it rebelled against them. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's like a fundamental attribute of grunge music. And grunge music is just one piece of a much larger movement that originated in Seattle, Washington, in the mid to late 1980s. And to me, it was all about that sense of rebellion. And I think that that's what it took most from punk music. Yeah. Was that kick against the system, but far less political. Instead, that cynicism was turned inward, right? Yeah. But also, while it did take some of like the faster beats at times, and the really, thrashy loudness of the sound, it also incorporated a lot of just the heaviness of heavy metal without the emphasis on really talented guitar solos. There's still solos in grunge. True. But they're not as technically complex because that's not the point.
Right, that isn't the point. The point is to say something with the music, to convey an emotion rather than to be impressive technically in any way. Which is kind of funny, because then when you get into kind of the early to mid 90s, you actually get a lot of really impressive instrumental work, but I think that's just a natural evolution of the sound, which we will get to. Another part of what you said, Jake, with it being a kind of rebellious in spirit kind of genre, they're almost rebelling against rebellion in some ways, because I remember hearing an interview with Dave Grohl where he was saying, one of the things that set Nirvana apart and helped make them so popular was the fact that they loved the Beatles. In their scene, it was actually frowned upon to listen to stuff as popular as the Beatles. So when you take that kind of like anti-attitude, but then kick against the rebellion and go back and start incorporating some of those melodic elements, I think that's what helped kick grunge into the mainstream, is that it had the attitude people were looking for, but it also just had a very core melodic foundation to a lot of the songwriting and the bands that were able to become successful in it.
How would you describe the lyrics many, if not most, artists in the grunge genre operating within that genre emulated?
This is something I want to dig into more when we get band by band, but because I think they approach it differently. But overall, they're definitely darker themes. they're much more personal and introspective, I would say, about kind of, any kind of torment or angst or, and I think that they pull a lot of that from punk, but whereas punk seemed to be kind of anti-establishment, this is actually similar to what we said on our Joy Division deep dive about the difference between punk and post-punk, whereas punk is more external, and then post-punk is more like self-reflecting and internal.
Right.
I actually think that grunge is similar in the lyrics. There's a lot more kind of self-loathing, a lot of inner turmoil
Sardonic
and struggle, right?
Lyrics.
But some artists approach it a little more satirically, and some artists are much more upfront about it.
Mm-hmm. How would you characterize the production value that you hear in most grunge sounds? Obviously varies artist to artist, but in general, if you're going to generalize for the genre, you can pull out some main themes.
Characteristics of grunge production, especially, I think it's important to think of this in contrast to the kind of rock that was popular in the 80s that kind of came before it. You look at a lot of like hair metal and glam rock metal, also just at 80s pop, stuff like Flock of Seagulls to, Duran Duran, anything like that. There was this attitude in the 80s as digital recording techniques were becoming more and more popular, to just get things as clean and as crisp and as separated as possible. And I think that grunge also kicked against that production style in the sense that things were very raw, things really kind of bled together in the mix. I think that there was an effort as you get into the 90s to keep the drums and the bass as clean as possible, but in particular the guitars were just wailing most of the time. A lot of natural feedback from just layered analog distortion pedals. In fact, Mudhoney's album that we're going to be talking about, Super Fuzz Big Muff, is just named after two distortion pedals that they used a lot in the time. So there was definitely that kind of like not lo-fi recording, but lo-fi performance aspect of it. Keeping things very real, just kind of squashing everything together in the sound.
It almost had a garage feel to it.
Yeah.
And I think that rawness to the sound was so critical to the image associated with the grunge.
Sure.
The grunge music scene that was so quintessential for it taking off. So we describe grunge's sound. You have the guitars that are very underproduced, but still very meticulous in their presentation and how, the sound is being crafted. This really loud, thrashy, kind of clangy sound with not a lot of technical expertise, but tons of attitude, just dripping with attitude. You have, the drums sound that, just monolithic and huge, right? And no electronic drums whatsoever. Everything had to be raw instrumentation. Right. You had the vocalists who were belting out impressive almost hard rock sounding vocals. Like you would hear classic rock artists from the 70s, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, bands like that. Their vocal presentation emulated that, but their lyrics were much more inward looking and cynical. And when you couple all these things together, you get something that was fairly new at the time. Nothing had really been done like this before, and if so, it was accidental, right? Where for the first time ever, in the pretty condensed place of the world, which at the time there was no internet, which is really hard for us, in 2016 to fathom a world where you're not being watched 100% of the time and there isn't a camera on absolutely everything. We like folks in our generation, we don't say folks, and B, we also don't understand what that world is like, where everything's interconnected, everybody can watch everybody at all times and knows what everyone's doing all the time. So when you think about that contextually and apply it to music, the way that people like you and I, Tom, would come about music, if we were doing this podcast, say in, the early 1990s, the way that we would get our music news isn't from checking a website. It would barely be from reading a newspaper or anything like that, because we'd be stuck with all the crappy Iowa bands. Iowa does not have the greatest music scene, and what we would be doing in turn is we'd probably be subscribing to some magazine,
absolutely,
some rock magazine, and like that would be delivered to our doors periodically, right. And we'd have to read about these scenes. So we were entirely dependent. We would be entirely dependent on whatever these music news agencies, whatever the music news media decided to put the spotlight on.
Well, and that's why you had a lot more like geographically localized kind of subcultures and styles popping up. And that's why Seattle was kind of the home of grunge in a lot of ways, because that's what people were doing there. They were kind of isolated.
Yeah, it was this isolated biosphere of music, and it allowed this whole scene to kind of grow and flourish as you had these influential artists who at the time were just nobodies, really kicking against the system and gaining a lot of followers musically,
right?
And from a lifestyle perspective too, because I think that one thing that we're gonna find here is we can't decouple grunge music from anything short of a lifestyle.
Yeah,
it is absolutely a lifestyle, from the way that people dressed, to the way that they acted, to their aspirations in life, to the music that they listened to. It was all based around kicking against the system. It was all based around a utilitarian focus on the self, and in almost in a negative way.
Yeah,
and expelling that from one system.
Though, it's interesting to me that while you're absolutely right that grunge is very much a lifestyle, it's really more of kind of just a sound descriptor than it is a genre. I mean, we're doing this genre deep dive, and certainly now in hindsight, grunge is definitely a genre. You can highlight some albums that really define it and so on. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that anyone in history has ever gone, I want to start a grunge band. Not in the same way that they say, I want to start a punk band, or I want to start a funk group or a rap group. I don't think anyone just said, I want to start a grunge band.
Oh, I totally disagree with that, though.
You do?
Yeah, I mean, Radiohead wanted to be a grunge. No, I'm not kidding. Radiohead wanted to be a grunge band
over in the UK. I know a lot of American music was influencing the scene over there.
Right. If you listen to Pablo Honey, it's their attempt to be a grunge band.
Sure.
In every way. And I mean, personally, I think they fell on their face because they were something different than grunge. Right. They didn't have that appeal,
which they found later.
Well, in a different form. I don't think it was grunge per se, and in the pure form of grunge, which is really what we're describing the scene that was created in Seattle. Was this pure movement that then gained popularity.
Right. Well, I guess what I would argue is where bands like Radiohead and several others might have heard that and said, I want to do something like that. Did they really call it grunge? I don't know. Because to me, it just seemed like something that evolved so naturally from this, primordial soup of other genres that it wasn't like a conscious decision for the bands that really spawned it. But obviously it got there at some point, and you're probably right. There probably were some bands a little later on and kind of riding the wave late of the grunge scene who said, like, I want to do this grunge thing. But I think that a lot of those kind of founding bands did, it was kind of a beautiful accident. They were where they were, doing what they were doing, and that's what it turned into, was a whole movement. So let's go ahead and jump into the history of grunge, and that primordial soup that I mentioned kind of spawned this entire like wave of music. Because a
wave of mutilation.
Yeah, kind of. And hey, that's like a good twofer of a reference there. We'll get to it. The thing that I find interesting about grunge when it became popular is that it really had a relatively short lifespan in the mainstream, but it had a lot of influences coming from it. If you go back to the mid to late 70s, I feel like that is when a lot of the hair metal and kind of glam rock, very over-the-top theatrical kind of rock started that really would dominate the end of the 70s all the way through the 80s. I mean, starting with bands like Van Halen and Kiss.
Even David Bowie.
Yeah, David Bowie for sure influenced those artists. You get into the 80s, you have bands like Motley Crue. A little later in the 80s, Guns N' Roses. Poison.
Def Leppard.
Right, exactly. All of these bands which kind of embodied popular rock in the 80s, but really it was a pretty long-lasting kind of genre when you think about it. When you think about a lot of popular genres as being kind of stepping stones from one to the next, this is the evolution of music. We can't just draw hard lines in the sand between a genre and another. But that is where things were. Now, a lot of people credit grunge with being the death of hair metal, like putting the nail in the coffin of hair metal. And, you could kind of say that, but I don't think it's as solid an act, as identifiable an act as putting a nail in a coffin. It was a slow death, I really think. And really, though, it started with the alternative underground punk, rock, and metal scene that was happening in the early 80s. So diving into the history, we're going to take you through a tour of kind of what I would consider to be early grunge or pre-grunge. It's stuff that influenced grunge that I don't think we can necessarily identify as grunge, but it certainly has some elements of that. Now, keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive, complete list. These are our highlights. We could talk all night about every single little thing that influenced grunge, but we're trying to pull some highlights here, and hopefully we do a decent job. So the first that I'm starting with is back in mid-1984 with Husker Du's Zen Arcade. This is a monstrous double album that from the what I would call punk or alternative rock group Husker Du. A lot of people, now this is a very critically acclaimed album. A lot of people cite this as being one of the best albums of the 1980s, one of the best albums of all time. I enjoy it, but I will say it's one of those albums I respect more than I enjoy even. I listen to it and I don't really want to come back to it all the time, but when I listen to it, I'm like, God, for 1984, these guys were setting the stage. With Zen Arcade, they're taking the ambition and structure of any of the Who's rock operas, making this story arc, and then they're putting it in a punk presentation. One of the things that I think is really important about Zen Arcade as well is that it's one of the earliest examples of punk really embracing melody. Bob Mould's songwriting style is always focused around melody. You hear that more when you get into his later bands like Sugar and even his solo career, but as his early work of Husker Du, they're still embracing melody in a way that I think a lot of punk bands were trying to kick against. And as I mentioned earlier, melody is a foundation of grunge music. It's what made it gain popular appeal, and it took a while to get there, but I think that Bob Mould and the guys from Husker Du were really setting the stage back in the early and mid-'80s. So then we're gonna skip a few years. We're gonna hop to 1987 with Melvin's Gluey Porch Treatments.
That's an interesting album title.
It is. Well, Melvins are an interesting band. To me, now, when people say grunge, a lot of people think Nirvana right off the bat. And from a popularity standpoint, that's probably accurate. When it comes to sound, I consider Melvins to be the epitomal grunge band. Mm-hmm. Like they're the kind of guys that like not only do they just have this sludgy metal perspective to them, but they're like, they scare the shit out of me.
Yeah.
I love how just absolutely brooding their music is. They seem like the kind of guys that like they would actually kick your ass. Mm-hmm. Like they're not just talking shit. They're not just like they're walking the walk, man. Like if you piss them off, they would kick your ass. And I love that attitude in rock and roll and in grunge. I think that kind of spirit, while, I don't think that any other band was really able to live up to it to the degree that Melvins could. I just feel like that attitude, a lot was taken from it. Still staying in 1987, we're going to jump to Big Black's Songs About Fucking. Pretty inappropriate album title there, but what can you do?
I thought the show was G-rated.
Yeah. Oh, is it?
No.
No, I just think we try not to drop F-bombs all the time.
I mean, we hold back a little bit.
We do a little bit, but the reason I find Big Black to be an important album is because it was Steve Albini's band. He ends up being a really, really important figure in music in general, but especially in grunge.
Produced a ton of other artists.
Oh, yeah.
Albums. Pixies, Slint, Breeders, Nirvana,
Absolutely.
PJ Harvey.
And not only did his production style influence the genre, but just his performance and songwriting style. You listen to Big Black, And I mean, they had several other albums too that I recommend checking out. I just think Songs About Fucking is probably the best one. But they also incorporate industrial rock, metal, punk. I mean, they really are a true fusion of all of those things and a huge influence on this scene.
Also in 1987, you have a key album from Butthole Surfers called Locust Abortion Technician. Another crazy crazy album title. I think in like the mid 80s, it was just about being as raw and original as possible. And that led to just the most creative, random album titles ever. How to describe this sound? I will admit, I am not a huge Butthole Surfers fan. This is psychedelic, experimental, and very noisy rock music with a lot of punk and kind of the laid the groundwork for a lot of sludge metal that would come later. Yeah. Just in general, the sound I found to be very abrasive and not something that really grasped my ears. And while that's a terrible criticism, it just didn't resonate with me very much.
Yeah, this album is all over the place, and Butthole Surfers as a band really were. But in spirit and approach, the way that they were recording their music, the kind of production techniques, the way that they were just mashing these like almost sound collages together, in a lot of ways I think is closer in spirit to bands like Sonic Youth than you might realize at first. And so listening to it in context and thinking about how it influenced artists like Kurt Cobain would take a lot of influence from Butthole Surfers, and taking that general punk attitude, but then starting to experiment with it. I think that we'll see that a lot in the grunge albums that we talk about. Moving on from there, we've got Dinosaur Jr.'s You're Living All Over Me in late 1987. We're staying in 1987 for just a little while longer.
It's a good year.
It is.
It gave you Jake Jackson.
Oh, did it?
Yeah.
That's the year you were born. July. Holy crap. Well, there you go. You're surrounded by Butthole Surfers and Songs About Fucking.
Story of my life, Tom.
Anyway, so Dinosaur Jr., this is one that I don't know if I really consider grunge, but when it comes to the very raw guitar sound, this in conjunction even with bands like My Bloody Valentine. Right. Also, I feel like Jay Mascis on this album, his vocals, sometimes I just caught like little glimpses that sounded like Eddie Vedder just a little bit. So as kind of a pre-grunge album, I think you listen to this and you can hear a lot of the characteristics.
The point is it's about mood, right? And Dinosaur Jr. in bands that followed, like Yo La Tango, really comes to mind. In My Bloody Valentine for sure fits into this description, but it's all about creating an atmosphere. It's all about creating a mood and using instrumentation and really volume and texture to create this sonic atmosphere. And that's what Dinosaur Jr. did so well on You're Living All Over Me.
Moving on to 1988, we've got a few key albums here. First, we've got Pixies' debut LP, Surfer Rosa.
Great record.
They had put out an EP the year before, but Surfer Rosa was their first full length, and wow. This is taking, all the lo-fi production qualities that you can muster, but making it like just presentable enough that it's not quite punk. But wow, did that sound fit their songwriting style and attitude just perfectly. And the thing about Surfer Rosa is the compositions are so wacky. They're all over the place.
And it's loaded with that absolutely, perfect brand of Pixies energy. I mean, it's just covered in this just exuberant energy.
Moving on to later in the summer in 1988, we have an album, Jake, that you and I had actually reviewed quite a while ago, and that's Jane's Addiction's Nothing Shocking.
The album cover was kind of shocking.
The album cover is quite shocking. And really, I think this album in general was shocking to a lot of people. But man, is this an album that to me, in a lot of ways, was ahead of its time, despite the fact that it was, it did get some popularity and some acclaim at the time. I think more in hindsight years later, now that we've seen the influence it has. But I absolutely adore this album. I can't think of anything bad to say about it.
Yeah, it's one of those that I feel like as I've come back to it since we reviewed it years ago, I've just loved it more and more.
Oh, same here. I can't stop listening to it. I go through binges of it all the time. The thing that blows my mind about it is in 1988, I mean, this was the year after Guns N' Roses' debut Appetite for Destruction came out, which I like that album all right. Admittedly, it's probably the only thing from Guns N' Roses that I do like, and it's still a little hit or miss for me. I think Guns N' Roses are a little overrated, but in particular, I juxtapose that album with Nothing Shocking, and like where everyone thought that Axl Rose was so edgy with his Welcome to the Jungle, oh yeah, this guy's badass, like everything that they were trying to do, I feel like Jane's Addiction just came in and did it so authentically, so much more artistically. I mean, Perry Farrell's vocals could just wail, and at the same time, the instrumentalists were working their asses off. You had Dave Navarro as the sole guitarist of the group, and he carried that sound so well. And this, I think, is really going to come into play years later with bands like Soundgarden and the more technical aspects of grunge that came closer to almost progressive rock, but were still able to keep a very raw and heartfelt kind of punk energy driving it.
Right. Later on in the fall of 1988, you had Sonic Youth's album Daydream Nation, which was actually a double record. Tom and you and I reviewed this a long time ago, and I remember, this is classified as just generic alternative rock, but Sonic Youth had been around for a while at this point. This is their sixth record, and fifth record, excuse me. And for such a prolific band already to still have this much impact on grunge music, I would say is something to be, to be recognized for. The thing that I really had, I've always liked this album, but the problem that I've always had with it is that I never really felt like it justified its length. I feel like it's kind of hit and miss at times with some of the tracks, but especially the first half of this record has always been just monumentally solid.
They were taking the noisier aspect of rock and that experimental kind of attitude that I was talking about, where you're not just playing your guitar straight punk stuff, you're getting feedback, you're playing around with effects.
Texture,
right.
Atmosphere.
Texture and atmosphere. That is a great way to put it. That's really what it's all about for Sonic Youth, because once again, as you put it, Jake, they're really trying to make a mood. So just a couple weeks after Sonic Youth's Daydream Nation, we had Soundgarden's debut, Ultra Mega OK. I gotta say, we're at Soundgarden's debut, so I'm just gonna get this out of my system, Jake. I love Soundgarden. They have the worst album titles. I have Ultra Mega OK, Louder Than Love, Bad Motor Finger, Super Unknown, and Down on the Upside. This is a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah, they really needed to, hire whoever thought of, Melvin's album titles or Butthole Surfer's album titles. They really needed to hire them to help come up with creative album titles.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that would have been a little edgier. No. Soundgarden's debut, Ultra Mega OK, and actually Louder Than Love, which would come out, not too much longer after Ultra Mega OK. I don't come back to those first two albums of theirs very much, but why I think they're important is because if you're jumping in on grunge around like 1991 or 1994, then you're probably going to wonder, how the hell do you even put these bands in the same category? Because by the time you get to that point, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Smashing Pumpkins, all these groups that really embodied grunge at the time, they didn't really sound anything like each other anymore. But if you go back to like 1988, 1989, with Soundgarden's Ultra Mega OK. A year later, we'll get to Nirvana's Bleach. These albums sounded a lot more like each other in production value, in general aesthetic, in general songwriting and performance. On Soundgarden's first couple of records, I feel like Chris Cornell hadn't really found his voice yet. It was a lot of kind of yelping and not really as much melody in there. Also, the instruments were a lot sludgier. They were a little slower moving as opposed to the faster paced kind of prog stuff that you'd see Soundgarden do a few albums from then. So I still think that the albums are pretty good, but it's you really see where all these bands came from and the fact that they really shared a common core.
I really like Ultra Mega OK mainly for that raw factor, and I think that was what was so alluring about bands in this genre at this time. This genre that hadn't really been named yet. It was kind of evolving from alternative rock, and it was so condensed. And being that these bands were starting to sound alike, I mean, that's I think really attributable to the fact that they were all very familiar with each other's works, playing off the same ideas, sometimes
playing
in the
shows
same,
together,
playing shows together, borrowing musicians with one another. I mean, I really feel like that just created this infusion of ideas, but kind of permutated and kind of created a homogeneous mixture of what the sound was, in a very positive way. And it really provided the foundational sound that would be carried out of Seattle. So the important thing about Soundgarden in this record is, while it is raw, it's a little bit rough around the edges, that adds to that authenticity that makes the sound believable, and it gives Soundgarden the allure to become one of those foundational bands in the grunge genre, or whatever they wanted to call it at the time. And the other thing to note is that this is one of the first bands that got signed to the Sub Pop label, and Sub Pop was the independent record label to really start. I mean, it's just associated with grunge, right?
So we're moving to 1989 now, the year that brought you Tom Hummer. Hey, couple years behind you there, Jake.
Taylor Swift and you got a lot in common.
God damn it! You had to ruin my birth year. You just had to. You bastard. So, no, actually, we're going to something even better than myself that came out of 1989, and that's Pixies' Doolittle, which I consider to be one of the best rock albums of all time. This album is incredible, and I would not consider Pixies to be grunge really at all.
No.
But they have some elements of it. More importantly, though, is the move that they made from Surfer Rosa to this album. Within, just a year, they're taking what was a kind of like slapdash kind of sound that they still mastered quite well. Moving from Surfer Rosa to Doolittle, they really cleaned up the sound a lot. You had Gil Norton producing Doolittle and made it just a much cleaner album. Track by track, you can just hear a lot more separation in the instruments, but it still has a very alternative 80s rock kind of feel. But that move in general is something that we'll see a lot of premier grunge bands making as they become more popular, get a better recording budget. They start to get a little more attention. We're going to see that sound get cleaned up in a lot of ways.
I remember reading that Nirvana had really taken to Pixies' music. And, what strikes me about Doolittle is that you really saw the evolution of, like, core singles coming out in Doolittle. I can think of a couple that come to mind on this record, and I think that really paved the way. This album in particular was inspirational in trying to make grunge music more accessible, because the early grunge albums weren't very accessible, as you were mentioning earlier, and they all had this very raw sound. They all kind of sounded alike, and honestly, they weren't that accessible, but that was what made them so raw, so original, so alluring. And then later on, as those bands started evolving and they started to, get like bigger record deals and things like that, because they couldn't just drop an album on the internet and let it explode all without, as an unsigned band. They had to get these big record contracts in. Well, big record contracts need singles, and Pixies kind of paved the way of how to do this well.
We're going to move to the summer of 1989 now, and this is a big one. Nirvana's debut album, Bleach. Nirvana, of course, as being one of the forefront grunge bands, their debut album, we're finally just now getting to it with all these influences that were kind of, playing their part on their sound. But Bleach, really, when you listen to it, is quite a bit different than the rest of Nirvana's work. And I'm not just talking about production style, although this does have a thicker, kind of sludgier sound than where we would see them go. But that kind of encompasses what they were doing at the time, which was really a little more metal than what we saw them do on later albums.
Yeah. Very punk influence as well. A lot of faster beats in this. There's a couple of songs here that are really up-tempo, which is not very normal for grunge music, or what was labeled grunge music.
Now, as a Nirvana fan, I know I'm going to sound like a total traitor when I say this, but I'm not big on this album. I really don't like it all that much. And the big reason for me is that while I like some of the songwriting, I don't feel like they had really settled into a natural sound, and particularly with Kurt Cobain's vocals. He's trying to be a lot more guttural here. He's trying to be more of a metal vocalist, whereas when we see them move on to stuff like, Nevermind, you see him get a little bit more punk in his approach. And I just feel like that punk approach suits Kurt Cobain's vocal style much better. Now, when we get to In Utero, I actually think it circles back to Bleach a little bit more than it does
purposefully.
Nevermind. Right. That was not accidental. But Bleach it's never really clicked with me, man. I don't know.
Yeah, he certainly, first of all, Kurt Cobain's vocal presentation here is something that's it's not accessible. Like what I was saying a couple minutes ago, this album, I think, was all about capturing, it was a snapshot of an attitude and a sound of where Nirvana was at the time. And, three guys just making, music that was original to them, that meant something to them. And if you listen to Bleach, I think that one of the things that you inevitably have to notice and accept about this record is Kurt Cobain shrieking. And then in addition to that, he's just often just repeating lyrics over and over and over again. And where he is credited as being this horribly gifted, almost over the top talented songwriter compared to John Lennon at times, it just doesn't make sense when you listen to Bleach, because it's so simplistic, it's so just repetitive that it almost begs the question, like, how did he actually get that label? Well, how he got that label is the change that he made from Bleach to Nevermind. Right,
yeah, it's all about the contrast there. And, I want to highlight the song from Bleach, About a Girl, which is the only song from Bleach that they play in their MTV's Unplugged concert, which was huge, of course, in the mid-90s. And I think that's really...
It's also the most accessible track on the album. It is.
That song... You're absolutely right. It's the most accessible because it's the most melodic. It sounds like a pop song that was just produced in the same vein as the rest of it. You could almost tell that on the album, it's like they felt uncomfortable with it because it didn't quite fit that kind of edge that they were going for with the rest of the album. So that it's like the song that almost kind of betrayed them on their debut, but it's a great track, and it really is a kind of a sign of things to come for the band when they move on to their next record. Moving on from there, we had another album from Melvins in 1989 with Ozma. Honestly, if I'm going to listen to Melvins, I'm probably going to listen to Bullhead or Houdini, which we'll get to Houdini in a bit. But I just want to bring up Melvins again because they're a big force, a big driving force in grunge, and they're still releasing albums around all these other bands as they're kind of getting more popular. But the thing about Melvins is they really keep it real. They really keep it dark. They keep it heavy and sludgy, even as they gain a little bit more notoriety.
So, Tom, I think that kind of wraps up the early initiative of the grunge genre, what was to be called grunge at some point. Once you start rounding out 1990 and getting into the early 90s is really when grunge music took off.
Yeah.
And to me, there really isn't one exact event that caused grunge to get popular. It was the culmination of many events. But what were some of the things that caused grunge to gain in popularity? We just named a ton of just absolutely brilliant records.
Yeah.
That have gone down in history as some of the best records of all time, of course. But those records weren't inherently grunge. So what caused the flip? What caused grunge to become popular?
So to me, there were two big things that really enabled grunge to become popular. First off, you had budget and production value increase as these underground alternative rock bands of the 80s started to become more popular. They were able to actually get the money and the attention needed to make this happen. And the second piece is there was also just an increased emphasis and acceptance of melody taking the focus in the music. Both of these things really gave a more accessible musical experience to the mainstream rock audience, who I believe were just ready for something a little more honest after this long wave of superficiality of hair metal and stuff like that in the 80s. I think they were ready for something that spoke to them a little bit more. Now, one thing I want to say too is we're talking about grunge for the purposes of this podcast, but in the early 90s, there was a ton of other music going on that had just as big a part. You had Red Hot Chili Peppers, you had Metallica, you had Tool, Rage Against the Machine. All of these bands were becoming popular at the same time, and while the bands that I just named I would not consider to be grunge, I mean, you can't deny their influence on mainstream rock, and it really helped to enable grunge to launch into its success as well. But it didn't happen overnight. You know, it had to be this kind of evolution. And the first album that I think we should talk about, while not one of the most popular or best-selling grunge albums, is Mother Love Bone's Apple. This is the point at which, and this is mid-1990, summer of 1990, these bands start to get a little bit more attention, and they're getting bigger record deals. Mother Love Bone, while, like I said, you know, we're kind of getting into this popular wave of grunge, but Mother Love Bone's a band that you don't really hear about much. Well, part of the reason I think it deserves to fall on this side of the line is because the production value is just much higher than what you were hearing from albums like Bleach and Ultra Mega OK. This album feels to me like the bridge between that glam hair metal stuff like Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, even like Aerosmith and Van Halen on the classic rock side. It's the bridge between that and the grunge in the vein of Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, later Candlebox, stuff like that.
Yeah, you hear a lot of guitar work on this record that isn't very grunge to me.
Right.
It's not about the attitude. It was more about the melody that you're hearing. And obviously that's why I think you chose to put it on this side of the line, Tom. And I would agree with that, just because it's more melodic. It was more focused on adding adding its sonic signature through melody rather than attitude. And also the musicianship of the parts that were being played. I mean, there's a lot of technicality here. So while its presentation might have been kind of grunge-like, a lot of just its core attributes in the songwriting were reminiscent of the bands you mentioned.
Right, and Andrew Wood's vocals I don't think really represent well the kind of lyrical themes and vocal presentation that really were characteristic of the other grunge bands, but it was an important stepping stone, especially when you consider the fact that several members of Pearl Jam were in this band, and being that they were in Seattle, as you said, Jake, they were all working together. Andrew Wood actually roomed with Chris Cornell for a given time. I mean, it was a community. That's what you got to understand. Yeah. So one band taking that step, even if it is a little bit outside the sound of what the others were doing, is still a big move for the entire scene. So just the next month after Mother Love Bone's Apple is released, Alice in Chains' debut album Facelift comes out. Alice in Chains is a band that I think gets criminally overlooked.
Now, I completely agree with you, and I'm totally guilty of this, Tom.
Yeah?
I have not really been an Alice in Chains fan. I listened to them obviously through you, and then just throughout the years over the radio. But digging into this podcast, preparing for this podcast, listening to albums like Facelift, I just loved everything I heard about from Alice in Chains.
So Alice in Chains, I think one of the reasons they don't get the credit they deserve is because Facelift, this came out before Pearl Jam's debut. It came out before Nirvana's Nevermind. It came out before Soundgarden had really burst through to the mainstream. This was actually the first of the grunge albums, like the main grunge albums, to reach the top 50 in America, and the first one to go platinum as well. So while a lot of people give Nevermind the credit for really making it very popular, which it still deserves that credit, I don't think that it would have been able to get there without the success of albums like Facelift preceding it by a year. The thing about Alice in Chains, too, that I think they get overlooked for is they were a consistently great band, but I don't think they ever really had the one album that just was the definitive masterpiece.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Soundgarden had Super Unknown. Nirvana had Nevermind, and In Utero, I would argue. Pearl Jam had 10. All of these were monuments in rock history. I don't think that Alice in Chains had an album like that.
They had key songs.
They did have they definitely had some key songs. Man on the Box from Facelift, incorporating that kind of like bluesy wah guitar in there, along with just the sludgy thump. I love that kind of contrast that they create in their sound. But Alice in Chains, I think if you were to take any of these bands, any of these grunge bands, I'd even throw Stone Temple Pilots, Smashing Pumpkins, some other bands we haven't even gotten to yet in that mix. I think if you played album roulette with them, you're the most likely to get a good album with Alice in Chains. They didn't have any stinkers.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
They were a consistently good band that every album of theirs from the beginning just did a good job. Now, Facelift as a good debut, I don't actually think that it was their strongest album. It's probably actually my least favorite, but it still comes out of the gate swinging, and the production is up to par. This is one of the first bands whose debut really just shot out into the mainstream audience with good production values and a couple of good hits. So that was really an important moment. We're moving on to just a couple months later in 1990 with Mudhoney's Super Fuzz, Big Muff, plus early singles. This is actually a compilation of the EP plus some singles. So these songs were a little bit older. Mudhoney was still around through the late 80s, recording these songs, doing shows and whatnot. But this compilation release is considered to be kind of a landmark in grunge, and it's kind of weird that we're putting this on this side of the line, because really this belongs more with the early grunge stuff. But the fact that this compilation was released in 1990 just kind of goes to show you, I think that record labels, and they were starting to learn that this was a marketable sound.
Yeah, they were recognizing the demand for the sound.
So they're like, well, shit, let's take Mudhoney's stuff, throw it together onto a compilation, and release it. And I don't think it ever really became successful as a lot of the other albums coming out around it. But in sound, it was very influential.
Moving on to April of 1991, we have Temple of the Dog's self-titled record, and this is the world's first actual introduction to the great Eddie Vedder, who will become the frontman for Pearl Jam, who releases their first album later this year. We'll get to that in a minute. But this also shows strong collaboration between members of Soundgarden and what would become Pearl Jam. And it's very different than Chris Cornell's approach on the first two Soundgarden albums, and really influenced Soundgarden's later work.
Right, because Chris Cornell had to figure out how to work with these guys who had previously been in Mother Love Bone. Andrew Wood, the vocalist, died. died, Chris Cornell wanted to record this album with the guys who were remaining as a tribute to him. But, he's got to kind of change his approach because these instrumentalists are used to, they play a much sharper, cleaner sound, closer to that of like Led Zeppelin than the stuff that Chris Cornell was doing with Soundgarden, which sounded closer to early Black Sabbath and metal work, right? So he's changing his approach, and I think that influences vocal style. Also working with Eddie Vedder, Eddie Vedder getting on the recording here, and he had been working with some of the remaining members to form what would become Pearl Jam.
And it's on the table, the mouths are choking, but I'm going hungry.
We also have in 1991 Smashing Pumpkins' debut, Gish, which also is another landmark grunge release. Now, Smashing Pumpkins, they're not from Seattle, so this is where we're starting to bring in some bands from outside.
Outside of Seattle, that's a bastardization of the genre.
I know, right? It's Seattle or nothing, man.
Right.
If it's not raining on you every day, how can you have that sound, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's why they're so self-loathing. It's always gloomy.
It's dark. Yeah, geez. No. Smashing Pumpkins was not from Seattle, but I still think that their sound, and especially Billy Corgan's just like unrelenting kind of rock whine, and I actually say that with as much love and respect as possible because I actually really like Billy Corgan's voice. Either you love it or you hate it. I happen to love it. I think it makes for a very unique rock experience, and really Smashing Pumpkins was doing that from the beginning. Gish is a really good album.
It's a great debut album.
It is a great debut album.
I've over the years this is the sort of thing. Never give up on a band because for so many years I told myself and had myself convinced that I hated Smashing Pumpkins. And I have to just come out and confess that I am absolutely wrong in every way about Smashing Pumpkins. This band, and I will give credit to what we've done, Tom, on Velocities and Music, and going through the process and kind of what we talked about last week on our genre bias podcast about forcing yourself to listen to music that you're not inherently attracted to or comfortable with, really expands your mental context and your ability to be able to understand and eventually like other bands that are outside of just the realm of your normal music listening experience. Smashing Pumpkins is totally that for me. I never liked Billy Corgan's vocals and really didn't like their approach to sound, just from a presentation style, from a songwriting perspective. But now, years later, I go back and I listen to these Smashing Pumpkins records like Gish, which is their first album. It's the most raw.
Yeah.
It's the most underdeveloped from the songwriting perspective for sure. To me, it's just loaded with brilliance, and you really see all the potential that's there for this great band, and I loved every second of this record.
Yeah, especially in the instrumentals. Their instrumental chops are terrific from track 1 on album 1. I mean, they set the stage early for that. I think that where they improve on their next couple records is just Billy Corgan's vocals. I think the melodies get better, and Billy sings with a little bit more conviction. Moving on from there, we have Mudhoney's Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge. Admittedly, Mudhoney, not one of my more favorite grunge bands, but they are a part of that Seattle scene. And the thing about Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge is they're really expanding the sound. I mean, this is a lot different than the stuff that you hear on Superfuzz Big Muff. It's a very dynamic record. You can hear a lot of Meat Puppets influence, even more so than you can in Nirvana, despite Kurt Cobain being a big Meat Puppets fan, singing a couple of their songs on the MTV Unplugged album. But Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge is an album that's hard to wrap your head around because it doesn't quite have that punk or metal spirit anymore, quite to the degree that their earlier, more raw work did. I mean, this is definitely a studio album.
All right, in August of 1991, you have arguably the best debut album of the grunge genre, if not one of the best debut albums of all time, with Pearl Jam's debut record titled 10, which I think had to be named after I don't know what it was named after.
I don't know.
10 tracks on the album? There's 11, right?
Dude, I don't know where they got the album title from, honestly.
We could
probably look into that.
The sound on 10 is monumental. This was a step forward for this genre, because the way that Pearl Jam are able to just fill a room. I mean, you put on any song on 10 and they're all classics. And I think that that's what sets this album apart and makes it, I think, one of the best records of all time. I would argue that. I absolutely love this record. I was raised on this record. I remember my dad, driving me around to like soccer practice or whatnot, as a very young kid, and him just blaring this, trying to like force rock music upon me. He's a good dad. Thanks, Dad. But like, so these songs to me are just ingrained into my music soul, and I can still hear like every single one of these tracks, which I think are just so monumental. The sheer volume that Pearl Jam present, whether it's the drums or just the absolute just beautiful melodic guitar parts that were still somehow very loud, angsty, and soul crushing at the same time. Eddie Vedder's vocals, I mean, are probably the best on this record than they are in any other of Pearl Jam's discography. And he has such a unique voice and such a voice that just kind of gets at your soul, that it really just invokes a lot of energy, and they capture it perfectly. And I think that that's what makes this record so special.
Yeah, I love Eddie Vedder's vocals. He knows exactly when to be smooth, and his smooth voice still has a very unique and kind of imperfect, gruff quality to it, which I think adds a lot to the authenticity of the band, which is really necessary because sometimes I feel like the guitars are so clean and sharp that they're almost sterile, in a good way, but in a way also that makes this hard for me to connect to. Objectively, from every standpoint, I have nothing bad to say about this album, but for me personally, I've always found it difficult to connect to for whatever reason. I think the problem is that with the instrumentals, like I said, they're almost a little too clean, whereas I get into kind of the sludgier aspects of grunge. And I can't quite relate to Eddie Vedder's vocals because despite this natural gruffness, he still feels kind of restrained. He never really lets loose in the way that like Kurt Cobain or Lane Staley did. But I think it's because they're just a much more controlled band. They're much more focused. And this, of all
and the production, I think, is far more pristine.
The production plays a huge part of it. That's absolutely true. But this is the most focused, deliberate, and confident release of the grunge era, I feel like.
All right, Tom, a month later, September of 1991, you have the record of all grunge records, Nirvana's Nevermind, their second record. What made this record so special?
What made this record so special was, well, a lot of stuff. We could spend all day talking about that, but I'll try to sum up my thoughts on it. It was just a beautiful coincidence of Kurt Cobain's songwriting growing into what it was from Bleach, taking that more melodic approach. Like you said, Jake, instead of just yelling or screeching the same line over and over again, he got a little bit more interesting with his vocals, not only his lyrics, but the way that he was performing them. They also got a little bit more of a budget once again, and they spent a couple weeks in the studio recording
their major label debut.
With Butch Vig. And I think that Butch Vig's production was huge on this. Kurt Cobain would later go on to actually be kind of disappointed in it because it felt like a betrayal of this sound that he had been trying to foster, and that sounded maybe a little more genuine to him. But that was really necessary in terms of getting this style to be more popular. I mean, everything on this album just sounds so clean, but yet it's performed with such energy, such just raw punk rock energy, that I think that combination, the clean production with Kurt Cobain's just unstoppable self, really, he just was who he was, just came together to make something that was relatable at a mainstream level, but still contained what was so present in the Seattle sound.
I think that one thing that makes this special is you have to focus on Kurt Cobain, because in this record, Nevermind, you really hear Cobain become somebody who is relatable.
Yeah.
Whereas on Bleach, he was not relatable at all. The music was not very accessible. And here on Nevermind, the music is so much more melodic. That shift into melody that we started to see with their single from Bleach, and now you're seeing more and more of that on the major label debut or the major label record of being the second record in Nirvana's catalog. You hear a lot more melody coming out, and I think that this sets up Cobain to really let more of his charismatic personality come out. And whether he wanted to be charismatic or not, he was. And in not only in his voice, his vocal presentation, but his lyrics became much more relatable. And he really improved as a lyricist, and that's very notable on Nevermind. But also just the way that he presented himself outside. They were getting all this attention, and this guy was very relatable.
Yeah,
and that's what I think added this allure to Nirvana's sound. He's also just a brilliant vocalist, and you hear that come out a lot on this record.
So Nevermind, and getting a little ahead of ourselves compared to In Utero, I feel like actually when we get to In Utero, I feel like In Utero has the better songs, but Nevermind to me feels like a much more complete album. This album flows, and a lot of it I keep coming back to is Butch Vig's production, because he cracked these guys into gear. He made Kurt Cobain double track his vocals and sing harmonies when he didn't want to. He made Dave Grohl do a click track. These things are important in getting a more presentable product, which is really what this ended up becoming. Butch Vig would go on to produce other albums as well, like with Smashing Pumpkins and so on. So that, getting that polished sound is a huge piece of it. But man, I mean, the songwriting on this album to me is just top notch. And I know that I'm probably the 10 millionth person in music history to say that in some kind of public forum. But I absolutely cannot get enough of it. This album to me, it is a masterpiece. But I'd be curious, Jake, where it falls for you, because you've never been a huge Nirvana fan.
That's absolutely true. This is a band that has grown on me over time. I remember very vividly in my middle school years loving this record and listening to the crap out of this. This in U2's A Chewing Baby.
Yeah.
Or Achtung Baby, is that how you say it?
I have no idea.
I don't know. It's Iowa.
Achtung.
So those two records I remember being 12 and loving, in the midst of, dreaming of one day having a girlfriend, and being the nerdiest kid on the block. I remember, this album I really related to back then. And then for a long time, I got away from Nirvana because I was into more edgy things like Dashboard Confessionals while I was growing up. But I've come back to Nirvana later on, because I guess I'm appreciating different things about it. Instead of the rage and the attitude, I'm getting more into the songwriting and the and the overall aesthetic of the sound.
And there's a lot to dig at there. If you pick apart the chord structures, the song structures on Nevermind, it's so much more than just this abrasive rock fronted by Kurt Cobain's captivating vocals. I mean, oh my gosh, like just what they're doing from a songwriting perspective, melodically in the chords. It's, for a three-piece, just kind of rock and roll band from Seattle, like they're doing a lot of stuff that to me is just magical.
Now, while you hear Tom and I gush over this album, imagine what the entire world felt when this record came out. People were saying all the things that Tom and I just said and much more. Because of this record's brilliance, it launched... First of all, it launched this record into, a huge, gross amount of sales, just absolutely unfathomable amount of sales. And it launched every band that was popular at the time into the stratosphere. It really took this genre into the mainstream, caused all the music media to focus their attention on the Seattle music scene and popularize the grunge lifestyle from fashion to attitude to music. All of those things became mainstream pretty much immediately following the release of Nevermind. Nevermind. Pearl Jam's 10, while it came out a month before Nevermind did, it was launched into popularity and became the number 2, and I assume it's right behind this record, Nevermind, but it became the number 2 album on the Billboard charts and sold just, millions and millions of copies. Mm-hmm. So with this increased popularity, this increased scrutiny and attention on this genre, all of a sudden, all of the bands that were participating, especially the Seattle bands, but even bands outside of that, were gaining all this attention and popularity and people buying all these records. And at the time, people actually spent money. I mean, this is the only way that you could, get music was to go out and buy a record. And so that's how grunge became very popular, was essentially through the vessel of Nevermind, launching it into the stratosphere.
And so from there, we also see then a more focused emphasis on bands kind of cleaning up their sound so that they could reach that level of popularity. And that's also where we start to see bands kind of branch out. When all of these groups were working together in this kind of isolated community of Seattle, there was a lot more similarity in the general sound. Once they got the budgets, they got the studios, they got the backup that they needed, then they kind of became a little bit more isolated from each other, and I think that their individual, more unique characteristics started to shine. You start to see now these bands sound almost nothing like each other, and we're going to jump to October of 1991 with Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger. This was kind of the start of the mainstream breakthrough for Soundgarden with singles like Outshined, Rusty Cage. This album is still kind of sludgy, kind of underproduced, but you hear Chris Cornell's just kind of classic belt of a falsetto and vibrato shine through the mix on this album in ways that you didn't on their previous two. And this really helped them to begin developing. No more do they really sound, to me, anywhere close to the likes of Nirvana. They're not focusing on power chords. They're not doing the kind of sludgy stuff. Well, I mean, a little bit of the sludgy stuff, but it's much more progressive. It's much more focused on these lead guitar lines and solos, which were something that hadn't really been used a whole lot, but now were more acceptable thanks to bands like Pearl Jam coming and making a bunch of money and selling a bunch of albums. From there, we're going to jump into 1992. So to wrap up 1991, we're going to jump to an album that actually, admittedly, Jake, before we were preparing for this podcast, I'd never listened to this album, and that is Screaming Trees' Sweet Oblivion. This, like I said, I'd never listened to, and I can see why it would be considered an important album in grunge, just in the fact that Screaming Trees was a band who had been around for quite a while, and now just all of a sudden, because these other groups are getting popular with this kind of rock sound, now this is getting a little bit more attention as well. The songwriting here, though, reminds me a little bit more like Black Crowes or even like a predecessor to Oasis than any of the other grunge contemporaries, but I can see why it's considered grunge in the presentation. It's just that it has more of a blues influence to me than a punk or really like a metal influence. But I'm really surprised that I had never heard this album before.
Next up, in September of 1992, you had the second album from Alice in Chains called Dirt. Mm-hmm. Dirt was a huge success for Alice in Chains. They had 5 different singles. I mean, most notable to me are Them Bones, Rooster, Down in a Hole.
Yep.
Those are the most noticeable songs and memorable songs for me. This is a great record, start to finish.
Another one I would add to that is the closing track, Wood. Oh my gosh, Lane Staley's vocal performance on that song just kills me every time. The thing, once again, I already mentioned, I think that the Alice in Chains is an underrated band, and one thing that I love about them is they were the truly like the most authentically just dark and tormented band of all of these. I think that Lane Staley and Kurt Cobain were kind of on the same level in terms of just personal struggle, what they were going through. I think they were trying to tell similar stories, but they told it very differently. Kurt Cobain relied a lot more on sarcasm and satire, whereas Lane Staley just put it out there. I mean, Dirt as being an analogy to his own drug addiction. He deals with it very head-on throughout this album. A lot of the themes, Jerry Cantrell, the guitarist, writing some of the lyrics as well, a lot of the themes are very personal, very dark, and they're not really trying to hide anything, but it matched the heaviness of the instrumentation as well. And Dirt, from a songwriting standpoint, from a performance standpoint, I just think is a significant step up even from Facelift. Now, on the same day, in 1992, we also had Stone Temple Pilots' debut album, Core. Stone Temple Pilots were actually from San Diego. They were not from Seattle, but just down the coast. So this is where
I don't think just being a little down the coast, I mean, that's a long ways down
the coast. It's
that's
a long freaking way
away
down the coast, but it's on the same coast at least. We can say that. But it is a long ways away. It might as well be a world away, right? This is where you start to get a lot of people kind of accusing these new bands, this new wave of bands like Stone Temple Pilots coming in, of kind of riding the coattails of the bands that came before them the couple of years before, which some bands I think kind of deserve it. You might disagree with me here, Jake. I don't think that Stone Temple Pilots do deserve that kind of criticism. Mm-hmm. I do think that they're a solid band.
Well, critics did not favor bands who came on the coattails.
Right. No, they didn't.
But fans, on the other hand, did.
They did. Some bands hated Stone Temple Pilots, though, just from the fact that Scott Weiland as a vocalist and as a frontman didn't seem to be quite self-loathing enough, I think. He was a showman. He was closer to the kind of attitude of like Axl Rose than he was that of Kurt Cobain. He didn't really seem to hate himself enough, I feel like, or have enough actual struggle. I mean, Stone Temple Pilots was rock and roll for the sake of rock and roll. They were more of just a fun band, a raucous band, but I never really got the impression that you got too much of the authentic, like, dark quality from them that you would the other bands. But I think that the production style, the presentation of it, a lot of the instrumentation is right on par with what the other grunge bands were doing at the time. So now we're going to move on to 1993 and 1994. Grunge continues. A lot of new bands start to form. A lot of the older bands are still putting out great albums. We had Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream in 1993.
It's a pretty good record.
Tremendous album. Nirvana's In Utero, where they go to Steve Albini producing it. They're going for trying to capture more of that thick kind of metal sound
kicking
that they had kicking against their own success.
Yeah.
With In Utero, where they're getting a little more abrasive in some ways, but then more melodic kind of ballad-esque tracks come out of that as well. So overall, an amazing album. As I said, I think it's better track by track than Nevermind, but
it's my favorite Nirvana album.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, and a lot of people are with you there, dude. Mm-hmm. But I think the back-to-back Nevermind and In Utero are just masterpieces. Also in 1993, on the same day that In Utero was released, you had Melvin's Houdini, which is widely considered to be Melvin's best work. It's also their major label debut.
It's a great record.
I love it. It's one that I come back to all the time. And Melvin's, I think it's interesting because where a lot of bands were cleaning up their sound, Melvin's were not. I'm kind of surprised that the label actually let them put this album out as it was, because it's really not much of a stone's throw from what they were doing on Ozma and Gluey Porch Treatments.
And that's probably why they're one of the lesser known grunge efforts, Like there just really aren't a lot of Melvin's tracks that you can go, oh, this song is really accessible. It's I can understand why a lot of people love this song. First of all, their listening experience is much more suited for the album listening experience, and their tracks are just so much darker and less accessible than a lot of their peers.
Mm-hmm. Going on in end of 1993, 1994, we had Pearl Jam's Verses, Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies at the beginning of 1994, which oh my gosh, it's actually an EP, but it blows my mind. You see Alice in Chains really stripping down their sound in some ways, making it more grandiose in other ways with the strings on I Stay Away. I mean, that album in like 30 minutes is so diverse and just displays some of the best songwriting of the 90s to me. Same thing with Soundgarden's Super Unknown, which came out in March 1994.
You don't really like that record.
Oh my God. So that is easily my favorite album of the whole grunge era. It definitely in my top 10 albums of all time.
Can you even call it grunge though, Tom?
I don't know if you really can. It's an album from a grunge band.
Yeah, because to your point earlier, yes, they had been labeled grunge.
Right.
This isn't the point where Soundgarden is kind of kicking against their own system as well and going in their own direction. This is just a more like a lot of the grunge tropes were starting to go by the wayside at this point. They were starting to look towards like having their own sound that was identified by very, very influenced by that heavy rock sound, that classic rock sound of the mid 1970s, and Super Unknown coupled that with a lot of the aesthetics that they had picked up from their era in grunge, but they had moved on from that. It's a natural evolution from that, and I think that it's good to use this record as a point in which talking about because. The end of grunge. I mean, towards 1994, you start to see bands, that were center in the grunge genre shift away from grunge music or specifically within that style. And you start to see other genres popping up.
Yeah.
And I think that the nature of grunge music is to kick against the system.
Yeah.
It is to absolutely rebel against anything that is popular. It is to be self-loathing. It is to be cynical. It is to be nihilistic about things. And so naturally, grunge artists are all about trying to be the most authentic. In fact, they were trying to out-authentic one another.
Right.
And the only way that they could possibly do that is by either A, never changing like the Melvins did, or changing their sound in such a radical way, trying to kick against the system like Nirvana did with In Utero by becoming more extreme, or by just owning and changing their genre like Soundgarden did.
Yeah.
There were really just a few different avenues that these bands went. What made matters worse is that you had a lot of other bands starting to pile on at this point. You had bands like Live, Hole,
Candlebox, Silverchair.
Yep. A lot of those bands, Bush is another one, just started, jumping into the genre, and these were outsiders. They hadn't been there. They hadn't been the founders. So naturally, their music wasn't rooted in, and a lot of people would argue Stone Temple Pilots and Scott Weiland, being the showman that he was, wasn't really part of that grunge attitude, which is what a lot of people would have argued at the time who were participating in that, the whole point of grunge.
Right.
So he was just bastardizing the sound and the style and the lifestyle, really. And I think that naturally this pissed a lot of the grunge purists and critics at the time off, and so all the bands started to kick against that.
Yep. It's like the bands wanted to evolve their sound because they had to get out of this. All these other bands jump on the wave and are like, hey, we want to do this too. And the original grunge bands are saying, guys, we don't even want to do that anymore.
Right.
Like, we don't even, we're done with that.
Unsurprisingly, it's why did grunge come to such a quick collapse? It was a very short-lived genre, and part of it is just the nature of the attitude that drive it. The forces that created grunge also tore it apart. And I think it's kind of a beautiful story because you see, it's almost like this beautiful coincidence, this natural phenomenon that happened that created this wonderful scene of music that lived for just a few years and then completely dissipated, but not entirely, because what it did is it had bastard children like new metal and post grunge.
Right.
And pretty much every artist in every album that came out in those genres, I absolutely hate today because they went away from all the things that made it authentic. They naturally catered towards just absolutely ripping off a style, but also a lot of just thoughtless songwriting tactics. A lot. You had even seen as grunge got more popular, you had seen grunge artists drift away from a more pure or experimental songwriting structure or sound, and they just took on traditional. They took all these like a lot of the aesthetics from heavy rock and punk music and applied them to the pop format.
Right.
And it really, especially like albums like Nevermind, it really got to people. It really shook people. But at the same time, as you take that to its nth derivation, it gets diluted and watered down.
And a lot, it's funny because a lot of my favorite quote unquote grunge albums are kind of the non-grunge albums from like 1994 to 1996. Now I love Pearl Jam's 10 and I love Nirvana's Nevermind, obviously, but the stuff that Pearl Jam did after that, Versus and Vitalogy, I actually like a lot more than 10 just because it's more experimental. I love Stone Temple Pilots' second and third albums, Purple and Tiny Music in 1994 and 1996. I really like the stuff that Alice in Chains was doing in 1994 and 1995 before they stopped. Jar of Flies and their self-titled album were great. Soundgarden's Super Unknown and Down on the Upside in 1994 and 1996. Like that span right there where all the grunge bands were kind of like, let's see what else we can do. You got Smashing Pumpkins' Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. They're seeing what they can do
really
outside of that
album.
Yeah, right. While all these kind of bottom feeders are coming in and kind of taking the genre, they're expanding their craft, and a lot of them just stopped. Alice in Chains stopped well before Lane Staley actually died. Soundgarden stopped. Pearl Jam kind of kept going, but they never really had the momentum that they did in the early days. Nirvana obviously ended in tragedy there. It's almost kind of it's a sad ending, but as you put it, Jake, kind of a beautiful story when it comes down to it, because it kind of had to end up that way, and really it ended up creating a lot of experimental and very interesting music by the time you got to the mid-90s.
Going through this exercise really taught me about, like, the biggest takeaway I have is just an appreciation for the metal music that is coming out today, because it is some of the best fucking music out there, and it is so. But like the best bands, Mastodon, Baroness, Death Heaven, they're taking from a whole spectrum. And they're taking the best qualities of all those and making good music out of it. And where would any of that be without grunge? Grunge kind of forced all rock music through a funnel. And out came this like really pure music for just a bit that then became and funneled out. So like grunge is like this like in between of like two funnels.
Right.
If you took two funnels and put the tips to the nipples together, like grunge is the nipple. And out the other end came all this other stuff that has fucking dissipated since then. And I think that that's the really cool thing, is it spawned this huge wave of popularity.
Yeah.
But then it absolutely just, all of those styles have fizzled out. And what remains today is some of the best rock music ever written. And the bands who are really doing it today, because rock music is not popular today.
No.
Electronic music, dance music is popular. Even most of your alternative music is infused with dance elements at this point. Rock music is dead for all intents and purposes in the popular music scene. But underneath the surface, there are these brilliant artists making all this great music, and it's because of grunge. It's because of this huge tidal wave that grunge created. That all these bands, as the wave crashed, all these bands fizzled out and allowed only the perfect, it's a true story of evolution, because only the bands that could evolve from that could, the cream of the crop, can survive.
Right.
And that is beautiful.
Now I want to make a point here. Exactly what you just said, you know what it also sounds a little bit like is the late 70s going into the 80s.
That's very true.
When you had rock bands like Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, bands like that, then going into Kiss and Van Halen, then going into the 80s, where, guess what? It got infused with some electronic elements. Sound familiar?
Right.
Now, do you think that there will be another 1991, another Nevermind and 10 kind of movement that will move us back into the raw honesty that we saw of grunge?
Now, wishful thinking, I absolutely hope that will happen.
Right.
Just because I think a lot of the music, I mean, I fell in love with music because of rock and roll, right? Like, so I naturally want that high energy, the visceralness of rock and roll, to come back into vogue. The problem is really two things. One, there is no like hidden. What made grunge possible was the little bubble of Seattle.
Yeah.
Of this organic music scene. By the time in this day and age, the camera's on everything. There's a microphone on everything. At this day and age, if anything gets any traction anywhere, it's all of a sudden a big thing, and then it spurts out before it's even popular. Look at what like even the electronic genre glo-fi came out in 2009, gone by 2011. 2011 dubstep is dead. Chillwave came on, and 2 years later it's gone. So we're going through these little micro genres, and we're just, it's like throwing away paper cups. Like you use them once and they're disposable genres at this point. These genres have their lifespan have iteratively gotten shorter and shorter. So I think that's a byproduct of just the ease at which we can create music. Yep. Everyone has a Mac computer with GarageBand on it, and they can make this brilliant music. And Tom, I've listened to your music for years now, and I know how hard it is for you to make a record, having witness your trial and tribulation. Have you gone through the process?
Yeah.
Because you're trying to use real instruments. Well, a lot of artists out there are just using electronic instruments. I'm not saying that it's not talent. It doesn't take any talent to do that, because obviously it does.
Yeah, it still does.
But you can do it on a laptop.
Right.
And you don't have to master the craft of several different musicians or instruments to create, or hire musicians to do this. So
I'm with you, Jake. I think technology is everything. Technology has made all the difference. And while I will never forsake my love of music and be cynical enough to say that everything that can be done has been done, because I firmly do not believe that.
Well, you also listen to Kendrick Lamar, so you know that that's not true.
Right, exactly. I do, however, believe that technological aspect, because we're all in constant communication with one another, because there are no secrets, and because no genre has the proper time to fester and develop in one area like grunge did in the late 80s and early 90s. Like you said, it's these flash in the pan things where things become way too popular way too quickly and then burn out. I don't think that we will ever have a single album or movement with that kind of impact, just because I don't think rock music is capable of it. Because honestly, I just don't think people are making rock music like they used to.
Right.
And I think that's a big part of it. But when that does happen, you get this kind of like, heard it before kind of mentality, which is really kind of a shame. But I think it would really take something very shocking and equally relatable to achieve that. And I think that's where it's just going to be tough. I don't know if we'll see it.
But still, I almost would prefer that didn't happen, though, I guess, at this point, now that I think about it. Because when I think of a lot of the artists that are out right now that I enjoy, Chelsea Wolfe comes to mind.
Sure.
Baroness obviously comes to mind. Death Heaven comes to mind. High and Fire comes to mind.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of these artists are doing things that are really brilliant, and the albums that they're putting out are excellent, and they're completely unnoticed, and that makes them special and unique to me.
Right.
And as I push my horn-rimmed glasses up and oil my beard a little bit more, as a true hipster would, I have to appreciate the underappreciated, artists that are out there.
Sure.
The rock music that is being made is typically of higher quality, because you have to be that good in order to be heard.
You make a good point. It's almost like the whole technological revolution in a sense backfires, because while you can think of the internet as bringing everyone together in such a way that it almost homogenizes everyone's tastes, it also allows the people in these niche subcultures to communicate and build communities in ways that geographically would have been impossible otherwise.
The digital Seattle.
Right, exactly. That's a great way to put it. You have these existing now in the cloud, quote unquote, which are just the words we use for Google servers, right? That they exist out there in space, and people can communicate that way. So maybe people are finding each other in ways that otherwise they wouldn't, and maybe we'll see some of these cool styles gaining support in kind of these grassroots way. Because as you said, Jake, a lot of these artists, they seem unnoticed, but really, what is noticed right now? It's only if you're Katy Perry or Taylor Swift or Mumford and Sons. Like, those are the bands that are getting noticed,
performing on the Grammys,
right?
Super Bowl spotlight,
right? Exactly. But you still have a lot of these rock bands doing some really cool stuff, and people are paying attention. It's just that I think that the people with the money and a lot to lose are not.
Mm-hmm. So to sum this up, Tom,
yeah,
do you have a favorite grunge album?
Am I allowed to say Super Unknown?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then it's Super Unknown.
Super Unknown.
Yeah.
Mine would have to be Pearl Jam's 10.
Sure.
But if I was going to dig an album out, kind of from the earlier days,
sure,
I think I would have to go with Alice in Chains' Facelift.
Yeah.
I really love that album.
I think Jar of Flies is up there for me. There are a couple songs on there, Don't Follow and Nutshell, that they like. Lane Staley's vocals are so like tormented that it's hard to listen to almost. Like he brings it. And I think that's just a brilliant work.
So what are your favorite grunge albums? Tom and I want to know, in what era of grunge do you feel resonates with you the most? The well-established era of the mid-90s, the heart of the grunge movement in the early 90s, or the early grunge years of the late 1980s? Let Tom and I know at velocitiesofmusic.com, Facebook, Twitter, your favorite social media network. Tune in next week for our monthly wrap-up of new albums released in March 2016. Got a lot of music to listen to this week, Tom. A lot of great albums have come out, and I'm going to admit that I am behind. So this is going to be a heavy week of just nonstop music listening, and I'm totally stoked for it. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation with Velocities of Music. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, Facebook messages, and emails. Your participation is what makes Velocities of Music possible. So as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities of Music, moving music discussion forward.